And we are live. Welcome to it, everyone. I am your hostess, BrigantiaBlackbird. This is the American Paganism and Witchcraft podcast, and I bring to you today, with great pride and enthusiasm, episode 5. We are going to be talking about the frontier spirit. And the reason why we're doing this is because for the longest time, I have really felt that there is a lot of commonality between the era of the Wild West in America and also of just kind of the general pagan ethos and just the spirit of it, the individuality of it, the grit that was required for either of those things to come into being. I think that the Old West truly is our mythological, legendary kind of landscape against which all of our legends can really be placed. We can put them up against that backdrop and it all makes sense. So that's part of what we're going to be exploring today. So, again, welcome to it, whether you are listening live or if you are listening on the rebroadcast. Very happy to have you here. Definitely say hello to me in the comments. I hope this will be a really nice back and forth opportunity for us all. And let's just dive right in, gang. So, hitch your wagon because if we're going to have the frontier spirit, that means we are beginning with those old covered wagons, at least in a metaphorical sense of the term. So, picture yourself lying out beneath the stars of a wide open plain, your campfires crackling away. You have a cast iron pot of beef stew simmering, and its aroma is starting to waft into your nose, and you know any minute now it'll be ready for you to have. Behind you is your covered wagon. It's carrying all the supplies you need to build up your new life. And even though you have faced storms and bandits and wolves and sickness and the untamed terrain, none of it could stop you, and you have now arrived. This is your destination point, and tomorrow you begin to build your life. You only negotiate with the land itself. You are forging your desires into reality with all of your knowledge and skills, and absolutely nothing is holding you back. I want you to feel this idea in your souls as intensely as you possibly can, because this is the mindset and, more importantly, the spirit with which we are going to be approaching this entire topic. And lest we forget, in so doing and exploring the very notion of American paganism and witchcraft, we are following in our ancestral footsteps into their spirit. While America was conceived and born during the Revolution, it was the Wild West and the frontier era that actually shaped our national character and culture. That was our primeval era. We were half wild, half civilized, and our ancestors who were there on the land during this time, they were tested in a myriad of ways. I mean, think about all of this. The landscapes they faced, from the plains to swamps to raging rivers and mountains and deserts and forests and canyons, all of it was unfamiliar to them. All of it had to be traversed and managed and survived in some form or fashion, and all of it came without an instruction manual. And then the weather. Oh my goodness. I mean, when you are traversing a continent, especially in North America, you are going to be facing things like tornadoes and floods and droughts, blizzards, the most extreme heat, and then deadly cold. And even if you go out to the right places, you would even have encountered earthquakes. That's what they had to face. And then the hostilities. Think about the Wild West era. They had just come out of the Civil War. There were conflicts between settlers and the tribes. There were tensions between established Americans and then the off the boat immigrants. None of these things could be avoided no matter how far out west you went. And then the wild animals. They saw buffalo and wolves and deer and moose and elk, mountain lions, bobcats, rattlesnakes, scorpions, hawks, vultures, grizzly bears, for goodness sake. And these were also animals that they had to figure out how to either avoid or fight or do something with them because they were present and they were always going to have to face that challenge. And then, of course, at this era, sicknesses were extraordinarily common. Things like smallpox and cholera, malaria, scurvy, even typhoid, diphtheria, tuberculosis, syphilis, influenza, fevers of all sorts. People had to deal with these things, and you didn't always have a doctor that was close at hand with you. You had to figure it out yourself. And then, of course, there were the deprivations. Food was scarce, oftentimes water was scarce, and that could get intensely dangerous. They had limited clothing, not just because of the era, but just because a lot of people moving out west, the reason they were moving is because they didn't necessarily have a whole lot going on for them where they were. So they wore the clothes that they had, and these clothes weren't always suitable for the environment or the weather at any given time. They had to deal with inadequate shelter, with supply shortages, and limited tools, and they only had so much weaponry. It was really a mend and make do kind of era. And of course, then we have the psychological toll on top of everything else. I mean, just imagine they were totally on their own, or at the very least, they were around people they didn't necessarily know or trust, which is quite dangerous. They were vulnerable to a wide variety of factors that were totally beyond their control. Their spirit of extreme self reliance was born out of necessity, and then they had to face the loneliness and the heartbreak of that situation. So many things could go wrong, and they had to persevere throughout all of them, which provides a powerful legacy for us to face today. The fact that the West was won at all is really a testament to the fortitude and character of people of that era. And regardless of what their personal theological convictions were, or lack thereof, they were living in kind of this mythic era on a landscape that created legends. They were walking with one foot on both sides of the veil just by the nature of their existence at that time. They were embodying the magic of the will and of sheer creative force. That is extremely powerful. And that is why I think this era, even down to this day, when we are so separated from it technologically wise, why it still lives so large in our imaginations and why there's just something about it, especially if we have family roots that go back to that era and beyond. It's why we just can't shake it. But while they did conquer the land, one thing still remains, and that is the spiritual settlement of the West. And by the West, I do mean America more broadly. Our ancestors did conquer the land, that's true. But the work of tying our spirits intentionally to the spirit of the land, that is a task that still remains for us to do. Now, one way we do this is by recognizing the magic that is beneath our feet and honestly all around us. Everything in our environment is infused with a magical force because everything that exists is. But we have to get to know it. We have to come to be attuned to it. And that's a big challenge we face. A second way is for us to acknowledge the grit of the pioneers, and that is a grit that really originated with our pagan ancestors. This was not born of peoples who turned everything over to God and they just accepted whatever came and they didn't go in with a defeatist attitude. They went in with an attitude of I'm going to survive. And that is the kind of attitude that comes straight out of the pagan world. I will survive, I will conquer, I will summon everything within me in order to leave my mark on the world. That is why I say the pioneers, regardless of their surface level convictions, they had a very pagan spirit. And then a third way we can really start to make this connection and engage in kind of this spiritual settlement is to recast our lore against the backdrop of the Old West. And we're going to get into a couple of ways that we'll be doing that. So, first off, let's just envision for ourselves what it would have been like if the Old West had been dominated by pagan peoples. Uh, And we know that the gods and our pagan ancestors and their spirits never left us, but it's true that many generations really failed to recognize their influence. And as a consequence, we've been dealing with many centuries of this veneer of Abrahamic religions. But still, the spirit of paganism and the spirit of the gods endured no matter how they were relabeled or recontextualized or what excuses people were making. And the connection between our ancestors and ourselves and between the gods and ourselves, it was never truly severed. So if we just peel back the layers of preconceptions, it's really not so difficult for us to envision what the gods might have gotten up to if they had been walking the earth during the Old West, or if we had been writing stories with them appearing in them and interacting with the world in their areas of concern. It's not that hard. And we're going to take a look at how easy it can actually be. So let's begin with one of the features that we have in every Old West story, and that is the presence of the law. Usually it's a pretty sparse presence, but it's there nonetheless. And so our first figure from this would be Sheriff Tyrus Kane, who's keeping law and order and is known for his fairness. And though he often wears a well-crafted prosthetic, Tyrus did lose a hand in the line of duty. But the stories of how that happened vary, and they are legendary in and of themselves. And with the aid of his deputies and his clerking assistant, Justine Wright, Tyrus always gets his man and sees to it that criminals are brought before Judge Forrest Glenmore. Then disputes in the community are settled, and total chaos is kept at bay, and the spirit of the law endures. So imagine this. Suppose we took the Norse god Tyr and related him to this character of Tyrus Kane, and then the goddess Justitia with the character of Justine Wright, and then Forseti, son of Tyr, as the judge Forrest Glenmore. Doesn't it see how naturally they kind of fill into these roles, how this relates to who they were and what they did in established pagan lore? That's just one example. We're going to go through several others. Let's look at the craftsman and tradesman side of things. We have Lou O'Connell running the local smithy. He shoes horses, makes tools and farm implements, and fixes wagon axles. This Lou O'Connell we can relate to the Celtic god Lou, who was known as the god of all trades and the god of all talents. Then we have Thomas Green, a railroad man, known for the quality of his work, and he was doing his part to ensure that the railroad stretched out west all the way to the Pacific Ocean. For that, I'm relating this idea of Thomas Green back to the Norse god of Thor. Thor with his hammer, Thor of the everyman, Thor of the ability to work hard, Thor the builder. Then finally, we have Jory North. He has captained everything from river boats to barges, taking peoples and goods to the next stage of their journey. So, Jory North, a good equivalency of him in pagan lore would be the Norse god, well, really the Vanir god, Njord. You see how it all comes together and knits together, and how they would still be enacting in their customary roles in this way. Then we have our healers. We begin with Dr. Asa Cleve, who carries his medical bag that has the snake clasp on it wherever a medical man is needed, and oftentimes he has his daughter Hilda in tow as an assistant. His two primary competitors in the field of medicine are Bridget Taylor and Irene Dunham, cousins who are known for their herbal salves, midwifery, and very down to earth approach to healing. So for the Dr. Asa Cleve, that relates back to the Greek god of Asclepius. And of course, his daughter Hilda would be Hygeia. And then for Bridget Taylor, that takes us back to the Celtic goddess Bridget. And for Irene Durham, that takes us back to the Norse goddess Eir, who was one of Frigga's handmaidens. So again, they are in their customary roles. They're just having somewhat different surroundings and different costumes than what we are often commonly thinking them of them. Then we have men of the land. We begin with Dagon Holt, the most successful farmer in the area. Everything he touches grows and prospers, and that is what relates him back to the Dagda out of Celtic lore. Then, not to be outdone, we have Zeke Tor, who is the premier cattle rancher, and he has a rather lucrative contract with the army. That takes us back to the Greek god of Zeus, who's in charge of everything, provides a lot of plenty, and of course, he's always on the side of more so the state and the execution of the duties of the state. And then we have the notable Frederick Potter, his wife Gretchen, and his sister Frida. They have quite the profitable pig farm, and they have created a secret barbecue sauce that is the envy of the territory. So for Frederick Potter, that of course relates back to the Norse god Freyr. His sister Frida takes us back to the goddess Freya, and his wife Gretchen, that takes us back to Freyr's wife, Gerder. They are all having to do with the plenty of the land. They are all having to do with life and the sustaining of it, and of course, the expansion of it and the enrichment of it. So, again, these are all very natural fits. Next up, we have the saloon, because of course you cannot have any tales about the Old West without involving a saloon at some stage. But inside the Thorny Rose Saloon, you will find Dion Edwards at the bar and Rosalie Clam managing her soiled doves that keep the clientele entertained. It's a place for locals, travelers, and above all, gamblers, of whom Luke Garrison is a fixture, though you never know what he might be getting up to. So, if we think of this barkeep, this Dion Edwards, that brings to mind of the Greek god Dionysus, because of course, if Dionysus had been present in the Old West, he absolutely would have been found in a saloon or in one of the professions related to it. And of course, relating to the management of the saloon girls, that we have this character of Rosalie Clam, it's easy to see how she would relate to the Greek goddess Aphrodite, because even in ancient times, she was considered to be the patroness of ladies of the evening, we'll put it that way. And then the gambler, Luke Garrison. Well, who else is more of a gambler in mythology than the Norse god Loki? Of course he is. And gamblers are unpredictable. Loki can be very unpredictable. Sometimes they're working the way you want them to, sometimes they are not, but they always keep things interesting. So again, we have that interrelationship right there. Then we have our outlaws. Our first outlaw is Hank Mercer with a band of bandits. They are forever robbing banks, holding up stagecoaches, and relieving trains of their payroll. This Hank Mercer is related to the Greek god of Hermes, who is known to be a bit of a troublemaker and a trickster. Then, riding in with a storm to wreak havoc, comes Seth Varn, who's more myth than man, and all the more feared for his absolutely inhuman violence. This Seth Varn we relate back to the Egyptian god Set. Given the deserty conditions of some aspects of the American West, especially the American Southwest, I think you can sneak in some of the deities that would have been related to deserts that were known to the Egyptians. So that's how Set comes out here. And he was known as being a very, very brutal deity. And then finally, deep in the wilderness, playing an eerie flute, is the madman Pax Wilder, who's capable of anything. And who else would Pax Wilder be but the Greek god of Pan? We can easily see all of these fellows engaging in things that constitute some more of the rough stuff in a more pagany Old West. Then we have our preachers, also a permanent fixture in all Westerns. But instead of us having a preacher who's giving his local congregation the sweet baby Jesus and then the fire and brimstone 1-2 punch, we would instead have a pagan priest and a pagan priestess who are preaching things like resilience and renewal and fortitude and endurance through all weathers and keeping your eyes focused upon what you want to accomplish and to orient people back to achievement and not letting their burdens or their setbacks get the best of them, but just keep moving forward. So for this, we would have Bram Jolson, who would be the bardic preacher, sharing stories with song and poetry, playing the guitar and composing ballads. And this, of course, would relate back to the Norse god of Bragi, who was known for song and music and skaldic poetry at a very high level. And then we would have Ida Wren Jolson, his wife, who engages in charity work, visiting the sick and uplifting the spirits of all. This kind of spiritual renewal really puts me in mind of Bragi's wife, Idun. She was the keeper of the sacred apples that actually kept the gods young in Norse mythology. So again, I think this idea of relating people to what were they doing, what kind of roles were they fulfilling in ancient mythology, and relating them back to a time period that is still in the past for us, but it still has kind of that mythic, legendary scale and scope of things. I think we see how these natural interrelations actually do exist. And then we have the Wanderer, who we are calling Orin Sage, who is a mysterious figure that only periodically comes down for the mountains. Is he a mountain man trapping furs, or is he a prospector for gold and silver? And has he just managed to be very discreet about his findings and their locations? What secrets has he discovered? We don't know. But if you encounter him during one of his treks to town, perhaps you'll be lucky enough to piece together part of his story. But regardless, make him welcome and always treat him well. So, with this character of Orin Sage, does that not put you in mind of the Norse god of Odin, who was known for wandering, known for going around incognito, and who was known to be the reason why people are said to always be very kind and polite to strangers, because it might be Odin in disguise? And I would like to welcome Brandy Young to the stream. Good morning to you, my darling. Hope you are enjoying this. We are exploring today how we can take the mythos of the Old West in America and relate it back to pagan personages and pagan storytelling and themes. Because I'm hoping that as American pagans, we can start seeing ourselves and seeing our legends and our myths more so in our own cultural context. So, thank you for coming along for the ride this morning. So, after we've gone through all of these various deities and the archetypes that they represent in the Old West, we see these are really echoes and shadows. And isn't it interesting to you that it's been quite easy to envision these things? They're in a different historical context. It is closer to our own time, but their areas of concern, the independence of their spirits, their values, they blend absolutely so beautifully with the Wild West era. And, just tossing members of different pantheons into this mix, it really mirrors the reality of the makeup of the American genome itself. All of us are descended from various different pagan peoples, and where we walk, our ancient gods walk as well. And so I think this is a pretty useful thought experiment and exercise for us to see them again more so in our own cultural context. And I think that American pagans and witches can just instinctively feel the struggle between order and chaos and wilderness versus civilization and the conflict between various peoples who all have their own agendas and wants and needs because it's our own history and our own ancestors in this country and the landscape upon which we live in the here and now. All of this echoes the themes we're familiar with in pagan lore. Now, the spiritual implications of this are profound and expansive. But it also means that we can, on this basis, truly come into our own and even tell the stories we are familiar with in pagan lore in our own context. So I thought, for our purposes of our discussion, I would actually take on that job right here. We're going to do Hades and Persephone, but we're going to retell them in the context of the American Old West. So in the retelling of this myth, Hades, we will call him Harold Nichols. Persephone will be Priscilla Daniels, and Demeter will be known as Widow Daniels. In this scenario, we have placed Harold Nichols as the undertaker in a very small frontier town. Then Priscilla Daniels, who's Prissy for short, is the only daughter of a widowed homesteader who spends her day helping her mother with their small farm. And then Widow Daniels is the industrious woman who carried on with the farm after her late husband's death. So that's our scenario. Let's get into our little retelling. April 1878. Harold Nichols turned the wagon around, lurching on the uneven path. The little cemetery, shielded by a grove of trees, soon faded out of view, though it took a bit longer before the sound of the funeral service escaped his hearing. His duty as undertaker was discharged. Death was an old acquaintance. It took on many faces in the plains, as well he knew. No matter how many the wildflowers grew, the lingering remains of death lurked beneath. Laughter brought him out of his reflections. Harold glanced over and saw that he was passing by the Daniels place. Miss Priscilla Daniels was working in the garden, and she was laughing at the dogs frolicking. Wisps of her hair escaped her bonnet, golden in the sunlight. Miss Daniels waved. He was surprised, but not nearly as surprised when she walked over and motioned for him to stop. Harold touched his hat as she approached and was glad he was already sitting down when she requested to be driven into town. Evidently, she was helping the local dressmaker with her work once a week, but on the sly. Her ma, Widow Daniels, didn't like the idea of her leaving home to work, so Miss Daniels just went to the dressmaker whenever her mother had occasion to make a weekly check on one of their elderly neighbors. So they went. Not just that day, but every week on the dot, Harold found a reason to be passing by and drove Miss Daniels, who swiftly became Miss Priscilla, who rapidly became Prissy when they were on their own. Weeks became months, and Harold couldn't remember when he had enjoyed someone's company so much. Prissy wasn't put off by his line of work, which was remarkable enough, but she was so vibrantly alive, it was as if death himself couldn't touch her vitality. Harold had never seen such resilience in a woman. Finally, he broke down and asked for her hand in marriage. Prissy smiled and waited several breaths before she said yes. The delay had nearly sent Harold into heart failure, but she had pledged herself to him. The only question was how to break it to her ma, who would likely be apoplectic at the thought of her daughter marrying and leaving home for good. In the end, Prissy persuaded Harold that it was best if they went straight to the preacher and then told her mother about it after the fact. It didn't sit right with Harold, but neither did a premarital confrontation with the widow Daniels. She might upset Prissy to the point that it would actually spoil their joy when they exchanged their vows. Once the decision was made, Harold and Prissy collected her personal belongings from her childhood home, packed the trunk onto the wagon, and headed for the preacher's. At such short notice, the only witnesses they had were Harold's assistants. But Prissy didn't seem to mind, and she sealed their vows with a kiss that left a brand on Harold's soul. After the ceremony, Harold brought Prissy to her new home, above the storefront of his business. Happily, she unpacked and got acquainted with the place. It was as though she had always been there. Before she could cook their first merry dinner, Harold received a telegram. There had been a terrible railroad disaster the next town over, and the local undertaker needed a helping hand. It wasn't the romantic interlude that Harold had hoped for, but there was a need, and Prissy not only recognized that he had to go, she insisted on accompanying him and his assistants. Between the excitement of getting married and the emergency of the train wreck, Harold and Prissy neglected to go and see her mother to explain their actions or to even send word to her of their marriage. While they set off to the next town to help tend the burials of the victims of the wreck, Widow Daniels arrived back at her homestead with no daughter to welcome her home. Distraught, Widow Daniels scoured the farm and rode around to her nearest neighbors to try and find what had become of Priscilla. After several days of searching, barely eating, hardly sleeping, the widow Daniels finally went into town to further her inquiries. It was the preacher who finally broke the news and got whacked over the head with the widow Daniels' parasol for his trouble. She was in such a fury, she went to the sheriff and nearly succeeded in raising a posse against Harold. As far as she was concerned, her daughter had been kidnapped and needed to be immediately returned to the family home. It wasn't until the preacher, who saw her into the sheriff's office, dashed in, out of breath, and explained that the undertaker hadn't stolen Priscilla Daniels. He'd married her a few days ago, with Priscilla's enthusiastic consent. The sheriff had stern words after that, and reminded the widow Daniels that her daughter was of age and it was no business of the law to go around interfering in family matters without just cause. Whether the widow Daniels would or would not have whacked the sheriff with her parasol remains a mystery as he shooed both her and the preacher out of his office and locked the door behind them. Hysterical, the widow Daniels refused all comfort from the preacher and screamed at anyone who came near her. She broke into the undertaker's shop, sat in a straight back chair, and just waited. Several ladies in the town managed to bully the widow Daniels into drinking water and at least taking some soup, so she was surviving, but her rage only grew. Luckily, a few days later, Harold and his bride returned to town. Both were shocked to find the widow Daniels holding vigil in the shop, and were more than a little ashamed of themselves for neglecting to so much as send word to her and causing her so much worry. Apologies were attempted, but the widow Daniels just reached for any object that was close at hand so she could hurl it at Harold, and the sharper it was, the better. When Prissy finally managed to restrain her mother, the widow Daniels began demanding that her daughter come back home, abandon this foolishness of marriage, and never leave her again. She wailed that she couldn't possibly go on with the farm or look after their elderly neighbor or even go on living. Harold watched his wife try to soothe his mother in law, who was already proving to be more of a challenge than he had bargained for, and grew concerned that Prissy's compassion for her mother might lead her to leaving him, or being unhappy if she stayed. They had only been married for a week or so, and had had a hell of a start by rushing off to deal with the victims of the train wreck, but he couldn't imagine doing without her now. She made the darkest of circumstances bright and brought hope to ruination. All Harold wanted was for her to be at his side in good times and bad. Finally, Prissy was able to get a word in edgewise with her mother and began laying down the law. She wasn't a young girl anymore, she was a married woman, freshly married at that, and for all she knew, they might be welcoming a new member to the family in 9 months, which led to renewed sobbing from her mother. Persevering straight through the crying fit, Prissy assured her mother that she was no stranger to responsibility, and just because she had taken on new responsibilities didn't mean she was going to neglect her mother. At planting time and during the harvest, Prissy swore to stay at the homestead and render her ma every assistance, and in between to visit her as often as she could. But make no mistake, she was not going to abandon Harold or the life they had begun together and everything that went with it. She enjoyed helping and making herself useful in dealing with the relatives' clients and sorting out arrangements of local wildflowers for the funerals. Eventually, the widow Daniels calmed. She wasn't happy, but she composed herself, accepted her daughter's marriage and the changes it would bring. It was some time before she had a civil word with for her son-in-law Harold, but all's well that ends well. And that, my darlings, is my westernized version of the Hades and Persephone myth. Now, you can let me know in the live chat or in the comment section below if you're watching the replay, what you think of that. But do you think that perhaps it's fair that it's very easy to see this story being retold in a more American context, that the reasons for people's actions and the symbolism, how it can all remain intact? When I think about American paganism, and witchcraft, it isn't about us, making things up as we go along or altering things beyond all recognition. It's just about putting our own accent onto things, and that is really for the purpose of a better understanding, and also for us to embrace our spirituality in our cultural context on the land where we live. I do think, if I may say so myself, that just this example does prove the point. So let's bring ourselves back to where we began. As lone settlers in an untamed land, armed only with our knowledge, experience, and the supplies we brought with us. Before in this presentation, we've explored how our ancient gods might have made their presence felt back in the formative years in our country. Then we've seen how ancient myth, with relatively few tweaks, can be retold in our own culture's mythological landscape and era. What remains for us at this stage is how we, as individuals, can take on the spiritual aspect of the job our settler ancestors began. Now, to begin with, they likely had to contend with the lack of confidence or even disapproval of the people around them before they ventured west. It took courage for them to go against the grain, and we do need that same courage today in order to define ourselves as American pagans and witches. Now, I'm pretty sure that anyone watching this and listening has their own tales to tell and probably their own war wounds from encounters with other pagans who didn't approve of what they were doing or thought they didn't know enough or didn't think they should be trusting their own judgment. We have already had to deal with confidence issues. A lot of us had to deal with confidence issues just to break free of whatever our previous religious background was, just to get to where we are. We know how much it takes for us to go against the grain. And I can understand for some people why they wouldn't want to necessarily take that extra trip to actually really personalize and culturalize their own spiritual path. But I believe in you guys. I believe in me. I believe in all of us. I think not only can we do this, I believe that we must. Next, our settler ancestors had the job of navigating unfamiliar and difficult terrain. Now, that's definitely something we can relate to on the spiritual level, not only because of the fragmented pagan record from overseas, but also just because every region of the land sings its own song, and this continent is no exception to that. And it's really up to us to learn to listen and to give the spirit of the land the hint that we want to listen and we are trying to listen and we are creating opportunities to listen. And that we're not going in with as many preconceived notions as what that spirit might fear. We just want to connect. And in order to do so, that of course requires that we actually go out there and we're not just experiencing our natural surroundings, but we are actively interacting with them. And thankfully, we already know how to do this. We absolutely do. You go to this place, wherever it is where you have a little bit more wild nature at hand. You collect a few rocks in the vicinity, you stack them with intention, and boom, you've created a mini altar. Or you go out to a forest and you find a favorite tree in the woods, you leave offerings for it. That's another thing that you do. You could speak to the river, ask its true name, et cetera, and so on. Use your imagination. We know how to do this. All that's really required is that we apply our knowledge and skills and just be consistent with it and actually build relationships. And like as of old and settlers in the Old West, we work with the materials we have on hand. There's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing inauthentic about it, quite the reverse. And all this adaptation, I mean, it's necessary. It was necessary for the pioneers to adapt, and we are not immune to that same need. They couldn't copy and paste, their way of life or the architecture of their ancestral homelands to build and live the exact same way on the plains or in the Rockies, to say nothing of the desert. Their materials were not the same. It was a mend and make do situation. They were limited by the manpower available. And that's hardly the circumstances that results in castles and cathedrals like what we would see in Europe. And likewise, we can't expect to build our spiritual traditions by simply copying what our cousins overseas do. And then if we don't, saying, oh, we have failed and we must never have our own ideas. We can't judge ourselves by how they relate to their environment or even over what terminology and language that they use. That is for them where they are. It's appropriate for where they are. It's not appropriate for here. We are governed by the patterns and the cycles of the land we actually live on, not on some romanticized fantasy of that cycle that exists on a different continent. The terms and language that we use, it should be in our own native tongue. It should make sense to us. We shouldn't have to, unless our goal is really to translate ancient pagan works, it should not be our highest spiritual goal to learn to speak in a different language or to practice in a different language. That is something that actually isn't authentic to us. Our native tongue is quite good enough. And keep in mind, whenever it comes to language issues, every language changes and evolves with the ages. So, who's to say that the ancient past had a holier language than what we use today, or that in the future it's not going to be holier than what we do now? Do we really believe that our gods are limited by language issues? Or is that something that human beings have taken on as a task and assigned to themselves because it's actually easier to learn old, dead languages than it is to face the scary frontier of deciding what you think should be done, how it should be done, and what terms ought to be used? Once you see it in terms about how some of these highly academic pursuits are actually spiritual distractions, it makes the issue a little bit more clear. And I think we desperately need clarity in America. And then when it comes to our storytelling, it can and it should relate to our history, our ancestry, and our cultural archetypes, which are distinct from that of our cousins. There's common threads, but it is distinct, and there's no reason why that shouldn't be reflected. And then we have the animal spirits we interact with here, the crystals and minerals and metals that are here, the native plants, the ones that we lean on the most should reflect what's in our local environment. The more local, the better, because it's available to us. It's what our ancient pagan ancestors would have done. Yeah, if you envision where your ancestors were, way, way back in the day, and if someone had, with the Star Trek transported border, beamed them up and then beamed them down onto the North American continent, don't you think that they would have also, instead of wringing their hands about what they don't have, they would have addressed their attention to what they do and making the most of those resources? And then with our lore, that's something we should be actively collecting and actively creating. This is a time when we have the opportunity for magical experimentation because there are different wildflowers, different uh, different herbs, different plant life in general than what they have in Europe, and we have the opportunity to study it in a really intense and personal way, and start getting better acquainted with its energies and all the things that it's good for. And also, what about telling our own story, creating new pagan sagas on this land? It's good that we're preserving our past, but we're not limited to the past. We have things going on in the present, and it's the future generation of the pagans who will look back on us and what we did in our stories and how we lived and what we did things and why. That's what they're going to look back to for inspiration. Now, taking all of this on, it requires that we have self confidence, that we have the ability to figure things out, that we can recover from our mistakes, and that we are competent enough to build. So I take a pretty dim view to all of the voices we can encounter out there, particularly on social media, who are trying to break down our self confidence or saying that we're somehow doing something wrong by going this particular route. Those are voices we don't need in our head. Those are obstacles. They are even mountains, depending on your temperament. And sometimes you do need to climb over that mountain and get through and have it in your rear view in order to know that you can survive it and that maybe the mountain isn't the boss of you after all. In short, gang, we need the frontier spirit. We don't need anyone's permission or approval, and it's past time that we stopped looking for either. So, the question I want to leave you with before I open this up to more general discussion is this: are you ready to be a spiritual pioneer? I really hope that you are. And I know that, a lot of people aren't necessarily listening to the live right now because I provided no notice whatsoever, and I apologize that. But I finished the presentation this morning, and I was so excited. I just wanted to instantaneously get it out there. So I know that my one person listening at the moment doesn't necessarily have a whole lot to say right now, just because it's a lot to take in. I've been putting things out pretty declaratively, and more than anything else, I hope I've really given you and anyone else who will listen later on something to think about, and something to think about the context of our own spiritual practice. And having a little bit more confidence in ourselves and not waiting on the rest of the world for permission. So earlier, Brandy, in reaction to the Hades and Persephone Old West retelling, said, "It feels like a relatable story." And I'm glad you say that because I think, especially if we start retelling the myths in our own cultural context, it will make a lot of things a lot more relatable to us. I think it makes it a lot easier for us to see the point of the story, what it was meant to teach, and also I think with modern day storytelling, I think it gives us the opportunity to kind of examine how various mythological situations looked from the point of view of every person who was present in that story, and then taking that bigger picture approach and thinking about, oh, well, this is why there was a conflict of interest over that. This is why these are very natural impulses that are coming out, albeit, on in a very loud way. And it can be difficult to handle these things. We can learn a lot about our own personal behavior of that, and even about the dynamics of our own families when we start looking at it from multiple point of views. I think, there's a lot of interesting challenges that we have ahead of us with this. I think there's a lot of opportunity, and I just hope, that presentations like this are starting to, whet the appetite of people, and also to start thinking about themselves in spiritual ways that are a lot closer to home. See, and Brandy Young says, "You've given me so much to think about this morning." Yeah, I'm glad that that was absolutely the evil plan, and I'm glad to see that it has succeeded. And I hope that it starts making people realize that when we talk about how, oh, everybody has different opinions and we have our own ways of viewing things, that that doesn't have to just be an empty platitude that we say, because oftentimes people will bring out those platitudes because, let's be honest, they're trying to avert a brewing argument within the pagan community. and and that's something that we just say because we're trying to not talk about something. But if we can get comfortable with the different ways that we look at these things, I think that'll be a great step forward for us, that we don't have to all be carbon copies of one another. And not only that, I would also like to really introduce the idea of regionalism. I told this in very much in the kind of that old West context, but maybe someone on the East Coast, someone who was in the original 13 colonies, maybe they would be looking back to that founding generation. And maybe that would be kind of the backdrop upon which they would really want to be retelling the myths. Or maybe someone's family came along during a little bit past the Old West period, when we were starting to build skyscrapers and we had these beautiful Art Deco buildings going up everywhere. Maybe that would be more so the mythos that they would be relating to. And of course, whether you're in the Midwest or if you're on the coasts or you're north or south in a desert or wherever else, looking at how these stories fit into where you live, I think that's something that is worth a lot of meditation. I think it's worth people, again, kind of saying that, okay, I just need to worry about what does this story mean for where I live? And by limiting the scope of things and you're not having to figure things out for absolutely everybody else, I think that makes the job a lot more manageable when it comes to interpretation. And also, I think it makes it a lot more personal because you don't have to explain to yourself, or envision a different environment in which the story is taking place. And Brandy says, I appreciate your fresh spin. Thanks for popping on. I appreciate you coming in to join me. My apologies for the people who just now joined us. We have reached the end of the presentation, but you can definitely go back to the beginning and run through the entire thing. And please let me know. In the comments, just what you think and your general impressions, and how you're interacting with this information, and how you're relating it to your own home environment. What historical time periods really speak to you? What do you think is really encapsulates the American spirit and how that informs your spirituality? I would really, really love to start a big conversation going. Also, guys, let me know what you thought about our little graphics for this. Do you think that I should be tailoring our graphics a little bit more for the subject matter of the presentations, or what do you think? Let me know about that and anything else in the comments below. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in. Thank you for those of you who watched later for watching all the way through. Many appreciations. Um, I'm not sure what we're going to be discussing in this series next month, but it will definitely be something. I might actually kind of take us back to the founding ideas and that philosophy, and how, underneath the veneer of Abrahamic religions, how there's really deep, deep pagan roots underneath that. I might go that route, but we'll have to see. We'll have to see where my brain goes. See, and Brandy says, I think you bring up an interesting point. How many of us move through life doing what we are told is right, but personally can't relate to the message of the stories or the myths? Yes, and how many people would have the courage to even admit that or bring that point up, Brandy? I think that's a brave thing you just did. And I think that it really is a wonderful challenge that you are setting before your pagan brothers and sisters, saying, are you just kind of taking out someone else's word for it? Or are you really thinking about what does this tell you? Because sometimes, especially when we read the myths and we rethink about the stories, different layers of it are going to hit us at different times depending on what life stage we're at. With Hades and Persephone, if you are a young woman, you might be absolutely in Persephone's shoes and wanting to set boundaries between yourself and your parents, and wanting to start a new life, and wanting to make yourself one with your partner in life. You might see it more from her perspective. But if you're older, if you're maybe a parent where you've been dealing with the kids leaving the nest, you might see things absolutely from Demeter's point of view of, why is my baby abandoning me? She can't possibly be grown up. I'm not ready for this. I'm going to be all alone. I mean, just depending on where you are in life, that can make a difference. And I think also, when you think about, why did they make the decisions that they did in the story? I think that also is a challenge, saying, well, how do I make decisions? What process am I actually going through? And just asking yourself different questions like that. I think there's a lot of ways where we can get beneath the surface, and just remember that our spirituality. I mean, we're not doing all of this reading and studying and contemplating because we're trying to pass a multiple choice test. I mean, that's not what any of this is about. It's all about what we take from it, and the most individual and personal level, because that's actually what's going to shape our actions. Because if our spirituality isn't shaping our actions, what's the point of any of it? I'm just saying. But my voice is about to give out, so I will have to leave you and love you there. Thank you again for coming. And again, for anyone watching the replay, please leave all your thoughts for me in the comments. I will see you guys, tomorrow in the next video of the daily forecast, but I will also, of course, see you in the next video of this series for July. So hope to see you then. But bye, everyone.